This week, John Strand and I are going to interview Eddy Bobritsky and Lenny Zeltser from Minerva Labs, talk about how to evaluate endpoint security solutions. In our technical segment, we're going to bring back Javelin Networks for some awesome content. They'll be talking about some cross-domain attacks that can take place in your Active Directory environment, ways to execute and defend against those. In the news, VMware, tackling threat intelligence, Fortinet. What else is in there? 5 most dangerous new attack techniques, according to SANS. WinMagic survey on GDPR compliance, as well as other things in the news, including Oracle and an endpoint survey from none other than Minerva Labs. So all that and more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly. This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly.
A tiger. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Enterprise Security Weekly. I don't know how this is going to go because Paul's not here this week, but we're just going to give it a shot.
Even if you've got experience in security, you can benefit from going to somewhere and learning about that bug again. Wearing my tactical turtleneck just for Mr. John Strand, who is on the lines via Skype. John, welcome to the program.
I'm wearing the tactical fleece as well, Paul. This is
Excellent.
A fully, completely, and utterly tactical show.
Stop attackers from domain credential theft and lateral movement with a 99% success rate by using artificial intelligence to control the attacker's perception of the environment. Javelin Networks is the world's first endpoint intrusion containment platform to protect domain networks. Javelin detects targeted attacks and breaches by obfuscating Active Directory, domain controllers, domain identities, domain credentials, and all domain resources. It only takes one compromised machine to jeopardize the entire organization. Don't be a victim. Visit javelin-networks.com and request a demo of AD Protect today. Are you worried about PCI compliance? Does your development team understand or care about security? Are you ready to face a breach of your customer's sensitive data? See the worst that can happen before it does. Black Hills Information Security can help you help management see the future. Email consulting@blackhillsinfosec.com to find out how a web application penetration test can mitigate the risk before you go live. Welcome, everyone, to episode 88 of Enterprise Security Weekly. It's Wednesday, April 25th, 2018. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian, joined via Skype by Mr. John Strand. John, welcome.
Hey, it's kind of shocking to be back. I think it's been like 3 weeks or 2 weeks since I've been out.
Crazy
travel, and
our
I'm only
schedules.
home for like a couple of days before I take off to B-Sides Charm. But yes, it's good to be on the show.
That's awesome. I know. Are you speaking at B-Sides?
No, I'm not. I'm just going out and working the vendor booth and showing off our active countermeasures AI Hunter. So
that's awesome. That's awesome. I'm excited. I'm excited for you. I'm excited for this show as well. We got lots of fun stuff. A couple of quick announcements. Make sure you visit our friends at itpro.tv, itpro.tv/Security Weekly. Get all of your ad hoc training needs satisfied, basically, at ITPro TV. 3,300 hours of training. I believe Adam will be on next week's show talking about, well, security, enterprise security stuff, which is what we talk about in the show. So let's get right into it and talk with our fine friends from Minerva Labs. We've got Eddy Bobritsky and Lenny Zeltser on the lines via Skype. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, it's nice having you on the show today. And the topic for today, I think, is a really hot topic in and I've come to use the term endpoint security because if you say endpoint detection and response, there's also endpoint protection, and I think there's a lot of confusion as to what it really means. But we're talking about security solutions that live on your endpoint as I'll frame the discussion today. And the hot topic is really how you test these solutions. And now I came up with 2 different kind of testing scenarios. I know that Eddy and Lenny have done a webcast for your audience at Minerva Labs on this very subject. John and I and others on the network have been covering it. And there's lots of different methodologies out there for evaluating endpoint security. And how do you do that effectively? So let's start with you're in the evaluation stage. What are some things you should begin considering if you work for an enterprise and you're evaluating endpoint security solutions?
Suppose we'll start by making sure that the company that's performing the evaluation understands themselves, what's important to them. Outside of the enterprise world, whenever people find out that I work in malware defense, they ask me, what's the best AV? Just tell me which one's the best for me. I want to install it. I'll buy that one. And maybe for consumers, it's a relatively easy decision. But in the enterprise, of course, when you're evaluating the security product, you would want to understand its efficacy against the kind of threats that you're concerned about. But also make sure that you understand what other testing criteria you're going to look at beyond the true security benefit that you want the product to provide. And that includes how easy is it to maintain, how compatible it is with your applications and your operating systems, what is the operational burden that you're taking on when you're going to be rolling out such a product. So know thyself as a starting point, and then define the success criteria so that you can evaluate the product in the context that's appropriate for you, which might be different from what would be right for somebody else.
Well, and Lenny, kind of on that note, one of the things that I didn't get a chance to talk to you whenever we were in Orlando is on that exact same concept of know your network and evaluate your criteria. It seems like a lot of people, whenever they evaluate security products, especially in the endpoint security product space, they stand up 4 systems in a lab, they run it in the lab, and they're like, yeah, it worked on 4 systems, but they do not understand the complexity of actually scaling that up to like 20, 30,000 nodes. And what are some challenges that you see with organizations that try to do that type of scaling, where something looks really good on 4 or 5 systems, but once they start scaling it up, it becomes very unwieldy?
Yeah, that's indeed hard, and that's what makes evaluating security products so difficult. It's a difficult project to undertake because yes, you can install a product in your lab, throw some malware at it if you're talking about, let's say, a malware prevention solutions, and maybe in the lab it performs according to your liking. But what would it be like in an actual environment where this product encounters other security tools that you have deployed, as well as your business applications that the product might break or somehow interfere with its execution? And also it is in that real world deployment that you get a sense for the ongoing operational burden for not only initial installation of the product, but also what kind of care and feeding it requires. For example, a product in a lab might perform very well in terms of efficacy, but that might be artificially inflated because it produces a high rate of false positives when you deploy the product outside of the lab. So what that means is that, yes, you got to start with evaluating the product in a lab, I suspect, just to get a sense for what it is you're dealing with. But ultimately, a successful evaluation, I believe, should include at least some systems in your production environment. Now, you got to feel comfortable installing the product outside of the lab, and it will take some time for you to get there. But ultimately, to see what the product can do for you, you got to install it on at least some real-world systems.
Yeah, and I think that's very challenging when you're evaluating endpoint security. Is how do you get malware? Like, do you go, I mean, you have your malware tests, right? And some of the results I've seen are like, well, in our independent tests, this product detected 100% of the malware we threw at it with 0 false positives. And I'm like, well, that's great. But like, what was your testing sample? Like, did you go out on the so-called deep web and go get some malware? And that's kind of dangerous, right? So how do you do a fair evaluation of the solution's ability to detect malware?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think, first of all, start with the success criteria, because in many cases you're evaluating a product because you have a specific pain point. So you need to understand what kind of threats, what kind of malware do you want to test it against. Then you got to find the malware samples. And of course, there's plenty of freely available sources for malware. If you just Google search for malware samples for researchers, you're going to find a bunch of links that you can get malware from. The challenge is that if you're looking at endpoint security products, in many cases, if you can find that malware, chances are the endpoint security vendor that you're evaluating also has a copy of that malware. And even if they talk about their advanced anti-malware protection capabilities, they might have just simply fingerprinting that particular sample. And when you evaluate that product in your lab, you might be just evaluating its signature-based detection, which might not be enough for what your objectives are. So one way to work around that is perhaps to ask a vendor for any samples that they might recommend for you to test, although recognize that if you receive samples from the vendor, then the vendor might show you certain kinds of categories of malware, and so that your testing should be augmented with some of your own samples. But also, you could get a copy of various packers that exist. And if you take some commodity malware that you might have come across on the web, pack it, and see how the product performs in that case, assuming that the product won't just trigger based on the existence of the packing mechanism, but you want to see whether it'll recognize that malware, prevent the infection, even if it's been mutated somehow to bypass signature-based detection.
Well, and also, Lenny, just out of curiosity, whenever you're working in this space, it seems, from my perspective, and I'm purely on the offensive side, it seems to me like a lot of these products that tout next generation artificial intelligence and all that jazz, at the end of the day, they do have some of those components, but they really also have a blacklisting engine underneath the hood as well. And it's very rare for there to be a product that's actually doing something that doesn't rely in some form or another on a traditional blacklisting approach at some base level.
Of course, basic AVs are very good at keeping the dead things dead, right? So, of course, part of any advanced endpoint security solution is this all, as you said, blacklist or signature-based database that they simply prevent before execution.
I think it's fine to have that a part of your product as long as you tell your customers that that is a part of your capabilities. And not all products rely on blacklists. Minerva, for instance, does not. But if you're talking about an antivirus product, then having a broad access to signatures of known malware samples, that's very effective to stopping, as Eddy put it, dead things that you want to keep them dead, right? Known malware, stopping it using simple hash lookups, it's very, very efficient and very fast, and in many cases is effective against popular malware. What you need to look at is how does this product perform against malware that has not been seen before, that has not been fingerprinted. That's where testing the product becomes much more important. That's why I mentioned some of the packers that you can get access to, or even just the kinds of tools that, John, I'm sure you and other people in pen testing, you rely on a lot, just tools like Veil, for example, that create malware that is designed to evade detection.
Yeah, and it's interesting that we've seen kind of an emergence in the market of both free and open source tools as well as commercial tools that are geared around attack simulation. And I think a lot of people are looking to these frameworks and tools to help them automate the processes that Lenny's talking about, to help them automate how do I generate a bunch of malware, deploy it to my test systems, and see if it was actually successful. Obviously, that's a very scriptable, automatable inside of a framework. We've seen the MITRE attack framework and work from MITRE. We've seen Atomic Red Team. We've also seen commercial vendors in this attack simulation space emerge as well. What are your thoughts on using both free and commercial tools to kind of help automate this process in the evaluation phase?
From my perspective, just freely available tools like Veil or Shelter Framework or tools like Lucky Strike, they can help you take a piece of malware and mutate it to see if your anti-malware product will still be able to recognize that the threat is going to be prevented. Now, Paul, you mentioned the MITRE attack framework, which I think is a very nice resource. It helps educate organizations regarding the various steps involved as part of the attack chain, and it breaks down the kind of details that you would get in the cyber attack chain into the specific steps that attackers use to ultimately compromise environments. I think that's a great framework in which you would be able to discuss the capabilities of a product that you're evaluating. I'm personally not sure that a direct mapping between a product's capabilities and the MITRE attack framework is useful outside the context of maybe auditing and compliance, but using that framework to have a discussion with a vendor and to better understand yourself where you need help. What aspects of the attack chain do you believe you have a gap that you want to cover? I think that's a very useful way to have a meaningful conversation with your vendor to understand what do they do and what do they not do.
And kind of, I wanted to kind of stop for a couple of seconds and back up. So whenever we're talking about endpoint security products, I think a lot of people mistakenly think like they think of like the Cylance and the CrowdStrike model more so than than they would otherwise. But your product doesn't actually work that way. It's not actually doing like the blacklist checking. It's not doing the artificial intelligence baselining. It's actually doing something very fundamentally different in how it analyzes the behavior. So can we back up for a second and talk about how you guys are actually handling that different? Because it is an absolutely different approach from a lot of the vendors that are doing things on the endpoint that we see littered all over the place.
First of all, you're right. We're doing something fundamentally different. We apply a preventative approach, and basically, I always like to ask a question that, how is that even possible with all these great security solutions in the market that we still have attacks, right? It's a cool question to think about. So the reason is basically, we just mentioned these tools that you're using to evaluate products, but it's like we are defenders evaluating products. The attackers can use them to penetrate your organization. And these tools are basically evasion tactics, evasion technologies to evade detection mechanism, because this is the majority of the market. At Minerva, we use a different approach of prevention that is not relying on detection. I know it sometimes sounds like a bullshit, but basically, if you can imagine a scarecrow doesn't need to detect a crow, right? Or fake camera in a bank. It doesn't need to detect potential robber. So same goes here. We basically build a simulation platform, anti-evasion platform, and we basically deceive the malware, fool the malware, trick the malware, but focusing on doing that. So in one case, we will simulate presence of security tools and forensics tools. So if the malware built to evade forensics tools, such as Sandbox, let's say, it will keep C-Sandbox around it, so it will never execute. Or if it's a fileless attack, so we'll lie on behalf of the operation system and saying that this specific injection that you're trying to do is not possible. Or if it's if it's a worm, we can say, oh, actually you already infected this computer, here's your mutex, and it will never execute. So this approach is very different. Strategically, starting from, instead of trying to detect malware, we're actually waiting for malware to come to us. We're not chasing malware. We're mostly chasing the way the security solutions look like, or operation system, or some different scenarios in the operation system, how they look like, to simulate them. So it's much shorter run for us. And instead of trying to detect multiple parameters to give you some certainty of detection of if it's malicious or mostly malicious or probably malicious, we need to intercept only one evasion technique, out of set of evasion techniques that the malware use. And basically, this is why, if we'll try to draw a graph of effectiveness of cybersecurity solutions and level of attack, the more advanced the attack will be, the less effective the solution becomes, because the attack is more targeted, it's more stealthy, it's more evasive. If it's more evasive, it has more evasion techniques. This is why for Minerva, that use different approach, it's easier to stop. So once you're building a strategy, you want to have at least one tool that improve effectiveness as the level of the attack going up. So in very advanced attack that will use hundreds of evasion techniques, it will be easier for Minerva to prevent it. Make sense?
Yeah. Now, Eddy and Lenny, do you find that customers are aware that they have gaps, or do they think that they have gaps but they don't know? Like, what's the driver? As I believe your product is going to sit alongside other products, right, and kind of fill some of those gaps. So, like, do the customers know that, or do they come to you to basically help them figure that out?
So, I think that first of all, the customer realized from our studies and from our interactions with CISOs, they understand they have a gap. Mm-hmm. This is why they're looking for the next generation stuff. The problem, and I think, as you mentioned, that we're sitting alongside other security solutions, is that we have huge overlapping between endpoint security solutions. Like, the old guys developing the new tricks, and the new guys, as we said, see that signatures is very effective, so they're adding these abilities to their solutions as well. So a lot of overlapping, and you can find customers that use 3 different endpoint security solutions. One of them more advanced, one of them is more older, but eventually they have pretty much the same coverage with single solution as well. So so when we started Minerva, we had two missions. The first one, we didn't want to overlap with existing solutions. So disadvantage, we not rip and replace. From my side, I believe it's advantage. But we're not replacing stuff. We're focusing on closing the gap of the evasive malware. The real gap. The reason that the customer believes that there is a gap is because of the evasion techniques and malware that evade detection mechanisms. So this is the first mission of Minerva. And the second one was to overcome the endpoint security challenges, because I see the greatest security, the endpoint security challenges are operational. You know, reboots, no prerequisites, user space only, support any flavor of operation system with no prerequisites, so on and so forth. It's very important to have, or integration with any other security solution for management or deployment or whatever. It's really important.
Yeah. So where do you find customers today kind of sit in terms of like their tolerance for how many agents they're deploying to their systems, right? We've talked about this in the several years, we've done this show, is what's the tolerance though? Like how many endpoint solutions should they have? And I get asked this question all the time, and of course it differs per customer, but like what's your strategy for what's running on the endpoint, and how do you evaluate all of these solutions and deploy them such that you have this set of solutions on your endpoint that are really going to protect you? Like what is it 30 agents? Is it 2? How do you help customers navigate those waters?
So it's a great question. Back to the overlapping stuff. I like to use very interesting metrics that I present when I meet with customers to map different kind of phases of the attack, and then I believe that any organization should have preventative solutions that focus on, first of all, to prevent stuff, and as a fallback, then it should have some detection-based solutions to cover the prevention. The very interesting question that I have to ask, kind of a brainstorming with you, is sometimes I hear CISO speaking about number of agents. But for me, they're focusing on the wrong thing. CISO is a security guy, he's not an IT guy. So his top priority is security. I agree that if we have 90% overlapping, you will be sensitive to number of agents. But if your agent really close the gap, and if it overcome the operational overhead challenges, I think it's no-brainer. You must have it. But you have different approaches in the market. Lenny, maybe you have something to add on this one?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is 42. 42 agents is what you need to have. No, of course not. Not all agents are created equal. And whenever you got to carefully consider, every time you add a piece of software to the endpoint, you got to determine, is it worth the operational burden? Does it do something useful to me? And I cringe when I hear about the idea of double stacking antivirus tools, because that is overwhelming. You get a marginally better improvement when you have two essentially AV technologies on the endpoint, but you've got at least twice as much of a burden operationally, and the chances that security tools are going to conflict with each other. But if you do have a security gap that you need to cover, and if you found a solution that covers that gap, then of course look at its operational requirements. To what extent will it add CPU load? What staffing do I need to have to roll it out, to maintain it? How much memory does it use, right? So you need to look at that, carefully scrutinize operational components of the agent, and only add that software which truly covers the gap that you might have and does not overlap with the functionality that you already get out of the operating system itself or from the third-party software you've already rolled out.
And what I love about this is you're right. It's not about the number of agents or the number of different signatures they might detect. It's about value, and how are these new solutions providing value? And value is measured in, like you said, closing some of those gaps, but also making you more efficient operationally. So I love the pitch, because I don't have to rip and replace, there's a huge cost associated with that typically, right? Especially if we're talking about 50,000 or 100,000 endpoints, whereas we can add something on that provides value, closes those gaps, but also makes me more efficient operationally, because I'm not dealing with as many false negatives and false positives when your product detects something, it's really good at not having any kind of a false positive because you're looking at the evasion technique. So that gives my SOC analyst something better to latch onto so that they're more efficient. Did I capture all of that? Because I think that's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Though I'm sensitive to the word detect, and you touched upon this earlier, right? We were able to prevent infections without relying on detection-based mechanisms, and that's what allows us to have a low rate of false positives, but a high rate of true positives.
John, more questions for Eddy and Lenny along these lines about testing and monitoring effectively for your endpoint security?
Nope, I think we covered it all from my perspective.
That's awesome. Eddy, Lenny, anything you want to share with our audience in terms of new product announcements or news from Minerva Labs? I know you just, I saw in the news this week, you conducted a study as well, a survey. So I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Well, yeah, I mean, so the study that you mentioned, we got responses from, oh gosh, how many? A lot. I think 600 security and IT professionals answered some of our questions regarding what's important to them in terms of endpoint security, and information about this case study is available online if you just search for Minerva Endpoint Security Survey. The goal of the study was to understand where are the perceived gaps in endpoint security. I mean, I'm a product manager. I'm looking to build useful functionality, but I don't want to overlap with what customers already get from other solutions. And then, not surprisingly, we found that organizations are concerned about the efficacy of their existing AV solutions, and they're looking to improve it. We also found that organizations are concerned that the next major malware outbreak, they might not be able to react to it fast enough. So yeah, if you want to know what's in the mind of IT and security professionals when it comes to endpoint security, and perhaps look at our analysis of the data, look up the endpoint security survey from Minerva. And then the other topic that we talked about earlier today is how to evaluate endpoint security products. My colleague at Minerva, Amri Moyal, recorded a really nice vendor-neutral webcast that you can find if you go to the Minerva Labs website and click on our webinar link. You'll be able to look at that webinar and perhaps learn something new and useful for how you might evaluate endpoint security products that you're considering buying.
Fantastic. Oh, the final point that we wanted to mention, we talked about earlier, was the space of automation in orchestration and how that ties into endpoint security. Are you guys seeing some real wins with being able to integrate, maybe some of your technologies with some of this automation? Like after you've done the evaluation, you've done the deployment, you're recognizing your gaps, but obviously you have to respond to those gaps, and automation and orchestration helps in that response. Are you guys seeing a lot of cool integrations there, or ways in which organizations are using that technology successfully?
Definitely. We at Minerva, as a preventative solution, as we told you, we didn't want to invent something that already exists. So once we prevent the attack, we prevented before infection, nothing happened, but the user want to do some actions after that. Like, for example, quarantine the file, or I don't know, update my intelligence base or whatever. So automation and prevention together is very powerful, and we do it with a lot of customers of ours. I can give you an example of, because of our approach that is not based on detection, in a lot of cases we stop something that's completely unknown. Maybe it's just the packer is unknown, or the malware itself, but it's unknown to the security vendor. And then once we prevent it, we update the reputation, like by cloud submission, or by if using specific vendor that have some kind of ability to integrate based on API. So we automatically execute an action with this vendor and actually saying, like, this is actually evasive malware. And then the vendor suddenly from unknown threat that is not known good, not known bad, is basically unknown, becoming known bad. And then it's updated within the organization, all the data, and then the AV starts to simply block it as a blacklist. And delete it from all the computers. So I believe that prevention and automation is a key ability to have in the future. Specifically, we have a huge gap of security professionals in cybersecurity market, and not all the organization can afford them to have the great people in the security operation centers. So we need to reduce to minimum the number of events that they need to deal with by prevention, and then to maximize the thing that we can do automation. Basically, what will left very small portion of events that they really need to focus on. This is what we believe in.
That's awesome. And if folks want more and want to set up an evaluation or a demo, they do that on your website, correct? And they have to schedule some time with you. Is that correct? Well, not you specifically, but someone from Minerva, they would schedule a demo with.
Reach out to us at minerva-labs.com. Easy enough to get a hold of us.
Awesome. Eddy and Lenny, thank you so much for appearing on Enterprise Security Weekly.
Good to be here.
Thank you, guys.
With that, take a short break. Come back with Enterprise Security News. Stay tuned.